In 1822, Te Whirowhiro, paramount leader of Waikato, looked out from the top of Matakitaki.
Matakitaki is a raised hill, sitting in a strategic position between the fork of the Waipa River and the Mangapiko stream. It overlooks the main route into Waikato territory and was defended by a network of 3 pa, or fortresses. They were surrounded both by walls and ditches and the natural defences of the rivers, dense bush and steep banks. About 5,000 Waikato Māori were sheltering inside.
Warning had come of a tauā, a war party. Now about 3,000 warriors of Ngāpuhi were outside. Ngāpuhi were there to avenge defeats in earlier conflicts with iwi from Waikato and Hauraki. Leading them was Hongi Hika, paramount leader of his iwi, recently returned from a voyage to England.
And thanks to Hongi's efforts on that trip, Ngāpuhi weren't just armed with traditional weapons like taiaha and patu. They also held hundreds of European muskets. At first, Te Whirowhiro took Ngāpuhi by surprise, raiding one of their camps, killing about 100 warriors and capturing some of their muskets.
But when his men returned to celebrate their victory, they were hit with musket fire from across the river, which killed combatants and non-combatants alike.
Seeing that slaughter and hearing the unfamiliar roar of gunfire, the people inside the pa panicked.
They tried to run, but a bridge across a deep ditch at the eastern end of the pa collapsed under their weight. Many were trampled or smothered to death.
In the midst of this chaos, Ngāpuhi made their assault. Te Whirowhiro and the other survivors were forced to flee. By the end of the day, it's thought up to 1,500 Waikato Māori were dead and hundreds more captured. The battle for Matakitaki was maybe the bloodiest in the history of Aotearoa. It's possible more New Zealanders were killed that day than any day of the First or Second World Wars.
But it was just one of a series of conflicts which were fought all over Aotearoa for more than 30 years. Out of approximately 100,000 Māori living at the time, it's estimated 50,000 were directly affected, killed, injured, enslaved, or forced to migrate from traditional lands, sometimes permanently.
These conflicts had a tremendous influence on the rest of the 19th century, and the aftershocks continue to be felt today, 200 years later.
These days they are most commonly known as the Musket Wars. So how did the Musket Wars begin? Let's start by setting the scene. James Cook's expeditions to Aotearoa in the 1760s and 1770s were followed by a series of visits from other Europeans, explorers, sealers, traders and whalers.
By this point, many Māori were well aware of what a musket could do. Some had seen them demonstrated by visiting Europeans, and some had been on receiving end of the guns as well.
But at first, visiting ships only sold the weapons in small numbers. Many were so badly made they didn't fire at all. Others could just blow up in your face.
And the first battle of the Musket Wars didn't do much to prove the power of firearms over traditional Māori weapons.
In 1807, a tauā, a war party of about 500 Ngāpuhi warriors made its way south to attack 2 rival iwi, Ngāti Whātua and Te Roroa. Ngāpuhi had a handful of muskets and must have been interested to see what they could do.
But they never got the chance. As Ngāpuhi settled down for a meal at Morimonui, north of what's now Dargaville, Ngāti Whātua and Te Roroa launched a preemptive strike.
Ngāpuhi rushed to load their muskets, but when they raised them to fire, the Ngāti Whātua rangatira, Murupainga, ordered his warriors to drop to the ground. The musket balls whizzed over their heads. And
before Ngāpuhi could reload, Ngāti Whātua and Te Roroa closed the distance and cut them down.
Eventually, a Te Roroa rangatira called Tāoho called an end to the fighting. He was related to Ngāpuhi through marriage, so he wanted to avoid an outright massacre.
Still, this was a major defeat for Ngāpuhi. There were so many bodies left in the sand, the battle became known as Te Kaia Te Karoro, the Feast of the Seagulls.
One of the survivors was a Ngāpuhi rangatira called Hongi Hika. Hongi's relative, Pōkaya, was the leader of the tauā and ordered him to flee when he saw the battle was lost. Hongi hid in a nearby swamp and watched as his friends and whānau, including Pokaia, were killed. Tikanga demanded that Hongi and his iwi respond to this disaster.
Now, you might think that having seen muskets fail to swing that battle in Ngāpuhi's favour, Hongi Hika would have decided these new weapons weren't worth the trouble. But he had a broader vision. Hongi had been trained from childhood as a war leader. He was a shrewd tactician and strategist.
He also had help from one of his wives, Turikātuku. Despite being blind, Turikātuku often went to war with Hongi. She was his closest advisor.
Hongi and Turikātuku believed that if Ngāpuhi could get enough muskets, they would be unbeatable.
And there was only one way to get muskets, from Europeans. Through the 1810s, Hongi Hika and other Ngāpuhi rangatira encouraged Christian missionaries to live in the Bay of Islands. Hongi never became a Christian, but he knew a missionary settlement would lead to more trade opportunities, not just for muskets, but all kinds of other new technologies.
By 1815, Hongi was the undisputed leader of Ngāpuhi, and more ships were dropping anchor at his home in Kirikiri. Hongi Hika was one of the great figures of New Zealand history, and he did more than just fight battles. He was a talented artist. He carved this self-portrait for the missionary leader Samuel Marsden. He was also a lover of innovation. He encouraged his iwi to adopt new tools and crops and to learn reading and writing. In 1820, he travelled to England with missionary Thomas Kendall, and while there worked with academics at Cambridge University to create the first Māori dictionary. He spent the rest of his time in England building diplomatic ties. He acted as an ambassador for Ngāpuhi, meeting with British aristocrats. He even had an audience with King George IV.
King George gifted Hongi a suit of chainmail armour, which he later wore in battle. It saved his life at least twice. But Hongi's visit to England wasn't only about diplomacy and dictionaries. When he travelled back to Aotearoa in 1821, he stopped in Sydney and picked up several hundred muskets and a huge supply of ammunition. These weapons kicked the Musket Wars into overdrive.
So traditional Māori warfare was mostly hand-to-hand combat with weapons like taiaha and patu. Almost overnight, Hongi Hika changed the game. He introduced massed volleys of musket fire, which could cut down enemies up to 100 metres away, making his forces all but unbeatable.
Or at least that's one theory. Other historians argue guns alone were too unreliable and inaccurate to give musket-armed taiwa a major advantage in battle. As Dr. Paul Darcy points out, fear of firearms and cannons soon gave way to an acute awareness of both their potential and their limitations. There are examples all over the Pacific of musketeers being overcome when their opponents anticipated their musket discharges and rushed in while the guns were being reloaded.
Many historians say muskets alone weren't enough to fundamentally change Māori warfare. They argue what really tipped the balance was another European introduction: the potato.
Potatoes were much easier to grow than kumara, and unlike kumara, potatoes weren't tapu, so there were fewer restrictions on who could grow them. This meant the best gardeners, who were also often the best warriors, could spend less time farming and more time fighting.
Also, potatoes could be carried long distances without rotting, which meant warriors could attack distant targets and support long sieges.
Some historians think potatoes were so important to these conflicts that the Musket Wars should be renamed as the Potato Wars.
I wonder why that hasn't caught on. In any case, by the end of the 1830s, Ngāpuhi taua had reached all over the North Island. The battle at Matakitaki in 1822 was just one of these conflicts. Ngāpuhi swept down the west coast all the way to Whanganuiatara, Wellington Harbour, made repeated forays into the Bay of Plenty, East Coast and Waikato, and even travelled northwards to the top of Te Hiku.
There are so many dramatic, heroic and tragic stories from these battles. You should really check them out. Some may have just happened in your backyard.
Now, you might think, thanks to all his victories, Hongi Hika would have become like the Emperor of Aotearoa, ruling over the lands of the tribes he'd conquered. But actually, Hongi almost never occupied the lands of people he defeated.
Territorial expansion wasn't Hongi Hika's objective. The point was mana and utu. We've talked about these concepts in previous episodes. Mana can be translated as prestige, status or spiritual power, while utu means something like rebalancing or reciprocity.
So Ngāpuhi weren't launching invasions to conquer land. They were settling debts, avenging old wrongs and enhancing their mana in the process. In fact, Hongi named his muskets after famous Ngāpuhi defeats as a reminder of the utu he needed to achieve.
Utu also shaped the response of the tribes Ngāpuhi attacked. These tribes didn't just suffer physically or economically, there was a spiritual and psychological element which often couldn't be resolved without utu. And that didn't always mean attacking the people who attacked you. The victim of a raid by one iwi sometimes sought utu by attacking an iwi or hapū, which weren't even directly involved in the original dispute.
This could create cycles of violence that went on, but not always. Sometimes hapū and iwi were able to break the cycle, te hoho te rongo, to make peace.
For example, in the aftermath of the Battle of Matakitaki, Ngāpuhi made a peace offering by releasing several high-ranking Waikato women they had captured. This was followed by a strategic marriage between Hongi Hika's niece and Te Whirowhiro's brother, cementing a peace between their respective hapū. But when battles did happen, things could get very nasty. Missionaries wrote in horrified tones about what sometimes followed these battles, kai tangata, or cannibalism, and mokomokai, the taking and preserving of human heads.
And just to be clear, historians question the accuracy of some of these accounts. Missionaries often wrote about what they heard secondhand rather than what they actually saw, and sometimes may have exaggerated the level of violence.
But it's clear from Māori oral history and eyewitness accounts that kai tangata and mokomokai did happen during the Musket Wars.
One of those eyewitnesses was Samuel Knight, a teacher at a mission school. He wrote about the aftermath of one battle he saw in 1836. Just a heads up, what comes next is quite graphic and you may want to skip ahead. So Samuel Knight says, "I came to a place where a number of bodies were laid out previous to their being cut up for the oven. A body, apparently that moment killed, was dragged into the camp before me. His head was cut off before I could look round. This did not seem to satisfy the wretches. His breast was opened and his heart, etc., steaming with warmth, was pulled out and carried off."
And it wasn't just Pākehā who were disturbed by this. It was pretty horrifying to Māori as well. Eating any part of an enemy or taking their head was a serious insult to their relatives. So why did it happen? Well, utu and mana were significant factors, but there were other reasons. For one, kai tangata was thought to give protection against atua, gods or deities. Eating someone literally made them part of you. That was thought to give protection against local atua, which might otherwise rise up against you as an invader.
Mokomokai, preserved human heads, also had practical aspects. They could be traded back to their relatives in exchange for a peace deal.
Plus, it wasn't just the heads of enemies which were preserved. Māori preserved the heads of their own whānau as well.
And while these aspects of Māori culture were disturbing to European observers, Māori were just as disturbed by aspects of European culture. For example, when a Ngāpuhi rangatira named Te Pahi visited Sydney in 1805, he was horrified to hear two men were about to be hanged just for stealing food. Te Pahi endeavoured to reason with me on the injustice of slaying men for stealing pork. With much earnestness, he urged his being allowed to take them to New Zealand, where taking provisions was not accounted a crime.
So, yes, the Musket Wars feature plenty of gruesome stories, but so do all other wars in history. And there are also plenty of stories of heroism, perseverance and mercy, like the story of Te Waru of Waitangi. His wife and children were captured when Ngāpuhi attacked Tauranga in 1820. While Ngāpuhi were celebrating their victory, Te Waru set out to rescue his whānau. Here's how historian and Waitangi Tribunal member Ron Crosby describes what happened. Te Waru stealthily approached the Ngāpuhi encampment near the mouth of the Wairoa River, where he managed to disarm the Ngāpuhi rangatira, Te Whareumu. Te Waru handed over his weapons to Te Whareumu and asked him to bind him and take him to the encampment. Once there, he asked for the release of his whānau. Ngāpuhi were so impressed by Te Waru's sparing of Te Whareumu and his courage in allowing himself to be led into their encampment that they acceded to his request. Moreover, peace was made, and to mark the peace, the Ngāpuhi chief Te Morenga made a gift of a musket to Te Waru before the taua departed.
Through the 1820s, an arms race swept across Aotearoa. Ngāpuhi desperately tried to maintain their advantage in firepower, while their rivals tried just as hard to catch up. But muskets were extremely expensive. Traders wanted up to 200 baskets of potatoes or 25 pigs for a single gun.
This encouraged a vicious cycle. Much of the food production was done by mokai, war captives or slaves. More captives meant more food meant more guns, and more guns meant more opportunities to capture workers.
Mokai were also part of a trade in mokomokai, the preserved human heads we mentioned earlier. European collectors and museums were obsessed with mokomokai. Demand was so high, traders were prepared to offer a musket for 2 heads. Hundreds of people were captured, tattooed and killed so their heads could be sold. Many heads were also stolen from burial sites.
This trade was formally banned by authorities in Sydney in 1835, but persisted beyond that. In modern times, major efforts have been made to recover these heads from overseas museums and return them to their descendants.
All this shows just how desperate the race for muskets got. Iwi and hapū who couldn't keep up often had to run for their lives. The area around modern-day Auckland, Tamaki Makaurau, was mostly deserted between 1825 and 1835 as local hapū fled to escape Ngāpuhi.
These heke, or migrations, were widespread during the Musket Wars and often triggered further conflicts. One of the most significant was led by Te Rauparaha of Ngāti Toa Rangatira. In 1822, Te Rauparaha and his people were driven from their home in Kāwhia by powerful musket-armed rivals from Waikato. Over the next 2 years, Te Rauparaha gathered a coalition of 2,000 to 3,000 people made up of his own iwi Ngāti Toa Rangatira and several west coast and northern Taranaki iwi. They journeyed south to Horowhenua, Kapiti Island and Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington Harbour.
Sometimes this heke was peaceful. Te Rauparaha, like Hongi Hika, was skilled at building alliances, but he also fought many battles with iwi which opposed his heke. And unlike Hongi, Te Rauparaha did occupy some territories he seized. He made up for the loss of access to lands in Kāwhia by capturing territory around Kapiti and the Wellington region. Then, from 1827 to 1836, Ngāti Toa and its allies struck further, invading the lands of northern South Island iwi and Ngaitahu further south, devastating Kaikoura, Akaroa and Kaiapoi.
This was partly to try and control the valuable trade in pounamu.
But those who were successful early on in the Musket Wars didn't always remain successful. Hongi Hika died in 1828 after being wounded the previous year during a battle at Mangamuka, north of the Hokianga. That same year, Te Wherowhero of Waikato launched the first of 2 successful toa in the Tāmaki, Whangarei and Tutukaka areas.
Ngāpuhi's unchallenged dominance of the Upper North Island was over.
In 1833 and 1834, Ngaitahu launched 2 toa the full length of Te Waipounamu, the South Island, seeking utu from Ngāti Toa Rangatira and their allies.
And as more Taranaki iwi migrated south, conflicts broke out within Te Rauparaha's coalition over rights to resources. In 1835, those conflicts encouraged 2 North Taranaki iwi, Ngāti Tama and Ngāti Mutunga, to invade and occupy Rekohu, the Chatham Islands, home to the Moriori people. We're telling that story in a separate episode.
Wars also ravaged the east coast, the central North Island and South Taranaki, as inland tribes got muskets of their own. Virtually every part of Aotearoa was touched by these conflicts.
Our best guess is that 20,000 people died during the Musket Wars, the highest toll of any conflict in New Zealand history, more than the First or Second World Wars or the New Zealand Wars. Plus, the population of Aotearoa was far lower during the Musket Wars than in other conflicts. So if you think of the deaths as a percentage of the total population, the Musket Wars look even worse.
However, you've got to remember the Musket Wars lasted more than 30 years, much longer than those other wars. So if you spread the 20,000 deaths over 38 years, the discrepancy isn't quite so large.
But however you look at it, the Musket Wars were unusually bloody, and there are a few reasons for that. First, these conflicts were fought inside Aotearoa. In the World Wars, New Zealand's non-combatants were mostly safe from the fighting. In the Musket Wars, they were right in the firing line.
Second, and probably most significantly, when we talk about causes of death during any war, we're including deaths from disease. And the Musket Wars overlapped with the arrival of a bunch of deadly new viruses and bacteria from Europe. And it's likely Toa and Heke helped spread these infections and worsen their impact.
Towards the end of the 1830s, the Musket Wars were finally coming to an end. Why? Well, again, there are several reasons. Probably the biggest was the end of the arms race, as historian James Belich puts it. The Musket Wars began when and because some Māori had muskets and potatoes, and stopped when and because everyone had them.
Plus, Māori had designed new types of defensive fortification, the so-called gunfighter pā. These had networks of palisades with deep trenches and elevated firing positions, enough to make any attacker think twice.
The spread of Christianity played a role too. While some of the missionaries helped perpetuate the wars by providing access to muskets, others preached against aggressive warfare and personally intervened to prevent conflict.
As time went on, Christian teachings became increasingly influential. For many Māori Christians, it became a point of principle to turn the other cheek rather than engage in violent forms of utu.
For example, Wiremu Tamihana Tarapipipi of Ngāti Hauā was a rangatira who took part in several battles in the 1820s. But in the 1830s, Tamihana converted to Christianity and became a dedicated pacifist, putting an end to feuds and speaking out against violence. In the process, he became greatly respected even by some of his former enemies.
In 1834, on the east coast, another Māori Christian, Piripi Taumata Akura of Ngāti Porou, imposed rules of warfare which banned cannibalism and killing wounded prisoners.
The Musket Wars also had a big impact on the founding documents of modern Aotearoa. He whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence, and the Treaty of Waitangi.
Part of the reason the missionaries lobbied so hard for the treaty is they hoped British intervention in Aotearoa might bring an end to the conflicts.
And some historians think Ngāpuhi hoped closer links with Britain would discourage Taiwa from southern iwi seeking utu for Ngāpuhi's attacks earlier in the war. You can also see that desire for security and stability in he whakaputanga, where the northern chiefs who signed the document say, "We invite the southern tribes to set aside their animosities, consider the well-being of our land, and enter into the sacred confederation of New Zealand."
And while the Musket Wars continued after the signing of he whakaputanga and the Treaty of Waitangi, British intervention did sometimes prevent violence.
The final conflict of the Musket Wars ended in 1845, when British officials intercepted a Ngāti Tūwhare Toa en route to attack Te Ihupuku Pā in South Taranaki. The Anglican Bishop of New Zealand and a British Army Major managed to talk both sides out of fighting. Ngāti Tūwhare Toa fired the final shot of the Musket Wars, symbolically into the air, before returning peacefully to Taupo.
But even after these wars ended, the consequences kept rippling outwards and set the stage for the next major conflicts in New Zealand history, the New Zealand Wars.
While the Musket Wars were raging, Pākehā were getting serious about colonising Aotearoa, and the places they chose to live were heavily influenced by the wars.
In some cases, it was a mutually beneficial situation. For example, Ngāti Whātua encouraged Pākehā to settle in Auckland, Tamaki Makaurau, in the hope they would help defend the region against future Ngāpuhi taua.
Other cases were much more messy. Settlements in and around New Plymouth and Whanganui were built on land some Māori had temporarily withdrawn from to escape pressure from rivals in Waikato. Pākehā then came in and negotiated to buy that land, while some or all of the rightful owners were elsewhere.
As you might imagine, this led to some very tricky situations and triggered several wars.
What's more, throughout the New Zealand Wars, the Crown relied heavily on Māori allies, and those alliances were heavily influenced by the Musket Wars.
For example, in the Northern War, Hongi Hika and Te Ruki Kawati fought a three-sided war against the British and a fellow Ngāpuhi rangatira, Tāmati Wakanene. Nene fought partly due to a personal rivalry with Heke, but also to preserve Ngāpuhi's relationship with Britain. Nene saw that alliance as crucial to preventing rival iwi taua from seeking utu.
Similarly, when Hongi Hika urged Te Whirowhiro of Waikato to attack Auckland, the Tainui chief refused. Instead, he vowed to defend the Pākehā settlement. Partly, that was because Te Whirowhiro saw Auckland as a strategic roadblock to any future Ngāpuhi taua.
The Musket Wars help explain why Māori as a whole didn't unify against the British during the New Zealand Wars. For many, the trauma of those conflicts was just too raw. How could you make an alliance with people who might have slaughtered your relatives just a few decades earlier?
But some managed to overcome that history. Remember Wiremu Tamihana, the Ngāti Hauā rangatira who became a devout Christian? In 1825, Tamihana had participated in a taiwa which resulted in the death of Te Whirowhiro's grandmother. But he and Te Whirowhiro were able to put that old grudge aside. In the 1850s, Tamihana was instrumental in making Te Whirowhiro the first monarch of the Kingitanga, the Māori King movement, which aimed to unify iwi and retain Māori land and authority.
And there's one final ripple of the Musket Wars, which we're still living with today. The horrific accounts of the wars from missionaries and other Pākehā writers painted a picture of Māori as an unusually barbaric or warlike people. Those narratives were used to justify British colonisation, and those justifications are still trotted out today. That's a bit hard to swallow, given many Europeans helped perpetuate these wars by, supplying all the muskets. And that Europeans have had plenty of their own nasty wars over the years.
Plenty indeed. The Musket Wars were horrific, but that's the nature of war, not the nature of Māori.
Kia ora, thanks very much for watching our show. If you want to know more about the Musket Wars, we've put a list of some of our sources in the description below. One we found particularly useful was The Forgotten Wars by Ron Crosby, so maybe give that one a try. Ka kite anō.